The land was already dead, baked hard by heat, stripped bare by cattle, and written off by scientists as a place that might never recover. Then something unthinkable happened.
As you can see, there's still moisture down here, but the soil is a mess. It can no longer regenerate itself.
Instead of trees or careful restoration, trucks began dumping mountains of rotting orange peels directly into a protected forest. This was not compost or a controlled soil treatment, but raw industrial waste spread thick enough to erase the ground itself. Lawsuits followed, and the project was shut down. Everyone walked away assuming the damage was permanent. But years later, the truth was far worse because what nature did next was insane. The land that was already destroyed. The site sat in northwestern Costa Rica, inside a region that had already been pushed past normal ecological failure. For decades, the land had been used for intensive cattle grazing, which meant constant trampling by heavy animals across the same ground, day after day, year after year. That pressure compressed the soil into a dense layer that behaved almost like concrete. Rainfall no longer soaked in. Instead, water ran across the surface, carrying loose particles away, and leaving behind hard, nutrient-poor ground, where roots could not penetrate beyond the top few centimeters. This damage was intensified by repeated burning. Ranchers regularly set fires to clear old grass and encourage new growth for cattle. But each burn stripped away organic matter that would normally replenish the soil. Heat baked the surface, killing soil organisms and destroying the thin layer where seeds might have germinated. Over time, the land lost its ability to hold moisture, meaning even heavy rains could not reverse the drying cycle. The more the soil dried, the harder it became, and the harder it became, the less life it could support. Native trees tried to return after grazing stopped, but they failed for specific reasons. Seeds did reach the ground, carried by wind or animals from nearby forest, but germination required moisture that no longer existed at the surface. Invasive grasses had taken over instead. These grasses formed dense mats with shallow roots that spread horizontally, intercepting rainfall before it could reach deeper soil layers. They absorbed water quickly and evaporated it just as fast, leaving nothing behind for slower-growing tree seedlings. Even when young trees sprouted, they died within weeks because their roots could not break through the compacted layer to access stable moisture. Years of protection changed nothing. The land was fenced off, grazing stopped, and fires were reduced, but the ecosystem did not recover. Without organic input, microbial communities in the soil remained depleted. Bacteria and fungi that normally cycle nutrients had no fuel to operate, so nitrogen and phosphorus stayed locked in unusable forms. This meant the soil was not just physically damaged, but biologically inactive. Plants that relied on those nutrients simply could not survive long enough to establish themselves. Because of this, scientists classified the area as functionally dead land. This did not mean absolutely sterile, but it meant the system could remain locked in this degraded state for centuries without external intervention. Ecological thresholds had been crossed, and the feedback loops that normally drive recovery were broken. Trees could not grow because the soil was dead, and the soil stayed dead because trees could not grow. Each failed regeneration attempt reinforced the problem rather than solving it. This distinction mattered because it defined the level of risk. In a mildly degraded ecosystem, failed restoration efforts usually fade without long-term consequences. Here, any mistake would compound existing damage. Adding the wrong material, introducing the wrong species, or altering the soil chemistry incorrectly could push the land further into collapse, making recovery not just slow but impossible. There was no margin for error because the system no longer had natural buffers to absorb shocks. This was not land waiting patiently to heal. It was land that had already exhausted its recovery options. Conventional solutions like planting seedlings, spreading thin compost layers, or waiting for natural succession had already proven ineffective. Each year that passed without change hardened the soil further and strengthened invasive grasses, locking the system in place. Faced with this reality, researchers abandoned gradual methods altogether. Instead of rebuilding the land step by step, they chose an intervention so aggressive that it looked irresponsible on the surface. T was 6N that bypassed slow recovery processes entirely and forced the ecosystem to respond immediately, whether it survived or not. The day industrial waste was dumped into a national park. The dumping began in 1997, and it did not look like a scientific experiment in motion. Truck after truck entered Guanacaste National Park carrying industrial waste from a nearby orange juice processing plant. Each load contained crushed peels, pulp, and leftover fruit matter that had no commercial use and would otherwise require disposal elsewhere. Instead of being spread thinly or mixed into soil, the material was released in dense piles across roughly 3 hectares of already degraded land, chosen specifically because it was considered ecologically expendable. The volume was extreme by design. More than 12,000 metric tons of waste were unloaded in a short period of time because researchers were not trying to enrich the soil gradually. Their goal was to overwhelm the existing system. Thin applications would have dried out, been blown away, or been recolonized by invasive grasses within weeks. A thick layer, measured in tens of centimeters, ensured that sunlight could not reach the surface and that air exchange at the soil boundary would be sharply reduced. This physical cutoff was intentional, even though it violated standard restoration logic. As the dumping continued, the ground disappeared entirely. What had been bare soil became a continuous orange and brown mass with no visible surface beneath it. Team members described the smell as unavoidable and persistent, caused by volatile compounds released as sugars and acids in the fruit began breaking down almost immediately. Flies arrived first, followed by beetles, ants, and other insects drawn to fermenting organic material. Larger animals followed the insects. The site became biologically active within days, but not in a way that resembled recovery. The researchers on site were not calm or confident observers. Many were visibly uneasy about what they were watching happen. They understood the biological theory behind the plan, but the scale created doubt even among those involved. This was not a controlled plot in an agricultural field. It was a national park, and the material being dumped was legally classified as industrial waste. Several team members expressed concern that the project would be stopped before it could produce results, not because it failed scientifically, but because it crossed regulatory and public boundaries. Those concerns proved accurate. To anyone encountering the site without context, the activity looked indistinguishable from illegal dumping. There were no signs explaining the experiment, no gradual transition from treated to untreated land, and no immediate visual indication that this was restoration rather than disposal. The waste smothered everything beneath it, blocked airflow to the soil, and released odors strong enough to travel beyond the immediate area. Park staff received complaints, visitors noticed, and competing interests took photos. The scale of the operation removed any possibility of quick reversal. Once the waste was dumped, removing it would require heavy machinery, soil excavation, and transportation out of the park, all of which would cause additional damage, and the researchers understood this clearly. The decision to proceed meant committing fully, knowing that if the experiment failed, the land would likely be worse than before. This was not a pilot test, but an irreversible intervention. The backlash escalated when a competing juice company filed a lawsuit, arguing that the project constituted illegal waste disposal inside a protected area. The legal issue was not biological effectiveness, but classification. Citrus waste, regardless of its organic nature, fell under industrial byproduct regulations. The court did not evaluate ecological intent, but compliance, and ruled to order all dumping to stop immediately. The sudden halt froze the experiment in its most unstable phase. No cleanup was required, and no monitoring was mandated. The site was left buried under decomposing material without oversight or data collection. Researchers were forced to leave knowing that whatever happened next would happen without observation, control, or intervention. At that moment, no one involved could say whether the land had been restored, poisoned, or sealed off from life permanently. The rediscovery that made no sense. After the court order halted the project, the site was effectively erased from active research. No monitoring equipment was installed, no follow-up surveys were scheduled, and no one was assigned responsibility for observing what happened next. The land sat under a thick layer of decomposing organic waste, exposed only to rainfall, heat, and whatever organisms could tolerate the conditions. If the waste altered soil chemistry in a damaging way, then the process would unfold without witnesses. If it triggered recovery, that too would happen unnoticed. 16 full years passed with no data and no certainty. When researchers decided to revisit the area in 2013, the trip was not framed as a success check, but as damage assessment. Several team members expected to find a sterile patch, possibly acidic soil, or a zone overrun by pests and invasive species. Some were even concerned that the site might be unrecognizable in the worst way, buried under collapsed organic matter with no plant life and unstable ground conditions. There was no confidence that anything positive had occurred during the absence. Finding the site itself was the first problem. Coordinates from the original project led researchers to a section of the park that no longer matched any visual record they had. The surrounding landscape still showed the same degraded features seen years earlier, with sparse vegetation and exposed ground. But within the treatment boundaries, the land looked fundamentally different. The original pasture could not be identified by sight because it no longer existed as open ground. This time, the area was covered by dense forest. Trees with tall trunks formed a closed canopy, while thick undergrowth filled the space below. Multiple vegetation layers were present, including shrubs, vines, and leaf litter that indicated long-term accumulation rather than recent growth. This was not a narrow strip or a partial recovery. The forest extended across the entire treated site with sharp boundaries where the orange waste had ended. Team members felt a mix of disbelief and confusion, not because forests are rare in the region, but because recovery of this scale had no precedent in similar degraded sites. Adjacent land that had been protected for the same amount of time but had not received the waste remained sparse and grass-dominated. The contrast was immediate and measurable. Crossing from untreated land into the treated area meant stepping from compacted ground into soft soil layered with organic material. Initial measurements confirmed what visual inspection suggested. Plant mass was dramatically higher in the treated area, not due to a few dominant trees, but because of a fully structured ecosystem. Soil depth was greater, indicating long-term accumulation rather than surface coverage. Animal activity was also higher, evidenced by tracks, insect diversity, and bird presence, all of which require sustained habitat rather than short-term disturbance. What made the discovery difficult to accept was the timeline. The transformation was not gradual in appearance, and there were no intermediate stages visible that suggested slow regeneration. The system had crossed from failure to stability without obvious transition markers. This contradicts standard ecological models, which predict slow, incremental change in severely degraded land, especially without active management. Researchers walked the site repeatedly, checking boundaries, remeasuring plots, and comparing untreated control areas to confirm they were not misinterpreting the location. Yet the data remained consistent. Whatever process had occurred under the decomposing waste had not merely improved conditions, but reset them. The immediate question was not whether the forest existed, because that was undeniable. The question was how buried industrial waste, left without oversight for over a decade, had produced a result that standard restoration methods had failed to achieve. Answering that required breaking down the physical and biological mechanisms that had operated unseen beneath the surface. The biological mechanism behind the change. When the team began breaking down what had happened beneath the surface, the mood shifted from curiosity to discomfort. The process was effective, but it was also brutal, and everyone involved understood that the land had not been gently restored. Instead, it had been forced into change under conditions that normally signal collapse. The first change was immediate and physical. When the orange waste was dumped, it did not mix with the soil or sit lightly on top of it. It buried the ground completely. In some areas, the layer exceeded half a meter, sealing the surface from sunlight and sharply restricting airflow. This was not incidental. It meant that anything dependent on surface exposure would either adapt quickly or die. Invasive grasses, which had dominated the land for decades, had no such flexibility. Their shallow roots depended on constant heat, light, and rapid water uptake. Once sealed under decomposing biomass, they lost access to oxygen and light at the same time. Photosynthesis stopped, respiration failed, and regrowth cycles that had survived droughts and fires simply ended. Team members reviewing early-stage conditions later described this phase as suffocation rather than suppression, because nothing about it was gradual. The grasses did not weaken slowly but collapsed. With them gone, the system lost the mechanism that had been draining moisture from the surface for years. Rainfall that once evaporated or ran off immediately began moving downward instead of sideways. As water accumulated beneath the decomposing layer, the soil responded mechanically. Compacted ground fractures when sustained moisture penetrates it repeatedly. Pore spaces reopen. Water begins to move vertically. This process takes time, but it does not require human input once conditions are set. Soil samples taken years later showed lower density and deeper penetration zones, confirming that the hardened surface had physically broken apart. The biological response followed quickly and aggressively. The orange waste introduced massive quantities of sugars and organic acids into a system that had been starved of usable carbon. Bacteria and fungi multiplied rapidly because they finally had energy, moisture, and insulation from heat. Researchers examining microbial counts later described the change as extreme, not because microbes are unusual, but because the baseline had been nearly zero. The soil had not been inactive, but had biologically collapsed. As microbes consumed the waste, they triggered nutrient cycling that had been dormant for years. Nitrogen was converted into absorbable forms, while phosphorus and calcium were released from locked states. And these were not surface effects. Nutrients moved downward with water, rebuilding fertility at depths where roots could survive seasonal stress. Team members reviewing chemical profiles noted that this was the first time the soil had functioned as soil rather than compressed mineral substrate. At several points during analysis, researchers acknowledged how easily this process could have gone wrong. Decomposition under low oxygen can create toxic conditions, including harmful acids and anaerobic zones hostile to plant life. That did not happen here because rainfall patterns, slope, and drainage allowed oxygen to persist at critical levels. The balance was narrow. If moisture had stagnated or waste volume increased further, recovery would have stopped cold. Once invasive grasses were eliminated and nutrients stabilized, native tree seeds finally had a chance. These seeds had always arrived sporadically, but previously they died within weeks. Now roots penetrated softened layers and reached stable moisture. As trees established, they reinforced every change already underway by adding shade, leaf litter, and organic input, accelerating recovery without external control. When the team connected these steps, reactions were not celebratory. Several described discomfort at how little margin existed between recovery and permanent damage. The system had not been guided carefully, but had been pushed so hard that it was left to resolve itself. The data made the outcome undeniable. This was not slow healing assisted by organic input. It was an ecological system forced past a breaking point where collapse flipped into regeneration because every variable aligned at the right moment. The data that changed ecological assumptions. Once the sheer disbelief wore off, the science team went into hyperdrive. They measured everything, and that's when the surprise turned into a scientific confrontation. The numbers didn't just confirm recovery, they completely blew up the old rulebook for ecological restoration. First up was the biomass, the total living plant material above the dirt. This is the ecosystem's energy currency. What they found was immediate, extreme, and borderline impossible. Compared to the land that had been untouched for the same time, the orange peel land had a staggering 176% more biomass. This wasn't a tweak, as it was nearly 3 times the living material of land following the accepted recovery rules. This wasn't just a few big trees faking the results. The site had rebooted its entire operating system and founded a complex, layered jungle with a canopy, thriving shrubs, understory plants, and vines connecting every vertical layer. The insect density was off the charts, which meant birds, reptiles, and small mammals were moving in. This wasn't isolated growth, but a coordinated biological explosion. Then came the dirt. Soil samples showed radical spikes in nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, and organic carbon. Forget surface-level mulch. The soil had been chemically and biologically rebuilt from the inside out. This eliminated the easy explanation that it was just temporary mulch. If it were, the nutrients would have flashed and disappeared. Instead, they were locked deep into the soil structure, stable and sustained. The land wasn't living on borrowed time, but was now running on its own powerful internal cycles. And the carbon data showed even bigger implications. The treated land wasn't just healthy, but acted like an atmospheric vacuum cleaner, storing significantly more carbon than the untreated site. In a degraded system, the land usually releases carbon. Here, that direction had violently reversed. Here's the part that broke the models. No one planted a single tree, no irrigation was installed, no fertilizers were added, no long-term management plan was in place. Standard restoration says this level of recovery takes decades of constant intervention. Instead, this system hit a certain point, a hidden threshold, and simply reorganized itself. The consensus was split between pure scientific excitement and a profound sense of terror. If ecosystems could flip this fast under the right pressure, then everything we thought we knew about restoration timelines was a lie. But that pressure is a double-edged sword. This wasn't a universal formula, but a system pushed to the very edge and lucky enough to land on the side of regeneration. This success story is actually a chilling warning about how thin the line between total damage and total rebirth truly is, and it had a dangerous lesson for us all. They dumped mountains of orange peels in a forest. What nature did next was insane. After the data settled, the team reached a conclusion that was far less comfortable than the success itself. The experiment had worked, but it had not been safe, controlled, or broadly repeatable. What happened in Costa Rica demonstrated that ecosystems can be pushed into rapid change using concentrated organic input, but it also showed how narrow the margin for success actually was. The same citrus waste that rebuilt the soil also carried serious chemical risk. As orange peels break down, they release organic acids as sugars ferment and microbial respiration increases. In controlled amounts and under well-drained conditions, those acids are buffered by soil minerals and microbial activity. In excess or in soils with poor drainage or low buffering capacity, acidity can spike beyond tolerable thresholds. When that happens, root membranes are damaged, nutrient uptake fails, and microbial populations collapse instead of expanding. Several researchers involved acknowledged that if the waste layer had been thicker, wetter, or applied to clay-heavy soil, the land could have been chemically sterilized. Oxygen availability was another critical factor that almost failed. Decomposition consumes oxygen rapidly. If oxygen drops too low, anaerobic microbes take over and produce compounds such as organic alcohols and sulfides that are toxic to plant roots. In many restoration failures involving organic waste, this shift creates soil conditions where nothing can grow for years. The Costa Rica site avoided this outcome because rainfall patterns and slope allowed excess water to drain, maintaining just enough oxygen for aerobic microbes to dominate. This was not planned with precision. It was a favorable coincidence. Team members reviewing these mechanisms later expressed concern rather than pride. The process had not been guided step by step. It had been set in motion and left alone. The system did not respond to intention or ethics, but to chemistry, physics, and timing. That distinction mattered because it stripped away the idea that good intentions could protect against bad outcomes. Another limiting factor was seed availability. Native tree species were able to colonize the site only because intact forest existed nearby. Seeds arrived continuously through wind, birds, and mammals. In isolated or fragmented landscapes, The same conditions could produce nutrient-rich soil with nothing capable of colonizing it. Without seeds, invasive species could return, or opportunistic plants could dominate, creating a different and potentially unstable ecosystem. Legal context also shaped the outcome. The project was halted abruptly, which prevented further dumping that might have tipped the system into failure. Several researchers later admitted that continued application, driven by early optimism, could have caused irreversible damage. The lawsuit that ended the experiment was not designed to protect the land, but it functioned as an unintended safeguard by stopping escalation. The broader implication unsettled many on the team. If ecosystems can flip rapidly once certain thresholds are crossed, then restoration is not just about adding resources. It is about knowing exactly where those thresholds are, which variables control them, and how easily they can be overshot. Most restoration failures do not happen because nothing changes. They happen because too many changes too fast in the wrong direction. Attempts to replicate the Costa Rica results without full understanding have already raised concern among ecologists. Applying large volumes of organic waste without site-specific analysis risks creating anaerobic soil, acid burn, or long-term contamination. Cleanup from those failures can take decades and often costs more than conventional restoration would have in the first place. What made the discovery difficult to communicate was its dual message. The outcome was real, measurable, and powerful, but it was not a recipe. It was a case study in how systems respond under extreme pressure and how easily those responses can turn destructive. In truth, nature did not reward creativity or intention. It responded to physical force, chemical reactions, and environmental timing. In Costa Rica, those variables aligned just enough to produce recovery. Because what nature did next was insane, and with minor changes, the same action would have destroyed the land completely. Make sure to click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.